I'm Dan Pablaki. You are listening to Our First Fears, a podcast about gateway horror, past and present, with artists working in the genre today. You might be wondering, what is gateway horror? Well, depending on who you're talking to, gateway horror is any kind of book, movie, TV show that may open the door to a young person becoming a lifelong fan of the horror genre. You may be wondering, hey, what gives this guy the right? Well, gateway horror is what I do. I'm the author of many books, many of them scary, and most of them for young readers. Some of the titles of the books that I've written are The Stone Child, The Ghost of Greylock, the Shadow House series, and recently, Tales to Keep You Up at Night. My 21st book, More Tales to Keep You Up at Night, will be released on August 15th, 2023. Today, I'm more than ecstatic to be speaking with author Anica Mrose Rissi, whose horrific collection of kid-friendly tales, Hide and Don't Seek, and other very scary stories has been called a Halloween goodie bag full of treats and not a few tricks, a gateway drug to Stephen King, and a modern-day classic. For Anica's first fear, she chose to discuss the controversial and legendary story collection from 1981, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, by Alvin Schwartz and illustrated by Stephen Gammell, which felt to me like the clear starting point for this podcast. In our discussion, we'll go deep into our own experiences of reading these stories as kids, as well as why the book as a whole is so effective and memorable. A couple things before we begin. Though this podcast is about childhood fears and the things that scared us as kids, every episode will not necessarily be child-friendly. So if this is something you want to share with the young people in your life, I'll be sure to give a heads up before each episode if we end up visiting some places that might make certain listeners weary. Secondly, despite being a horror author, I am also a great big bundle of nerves. Since this is my first podcast and I'm learning as I go, I do have my own adult fears of putting this out into the world. I stammer and stutter, I say and like a lot. I've managed to edit out many of those ums and likes and uhs. However, I do apologize, and I thank you for sticking with me because I promise I am getting better. But for now, turn down the lights, turn up the volume, and get ready to explore our first fears. Hi, Anica. Thank you so much for agreeing to join me in this discussion about scary stories.
Hi, Dan. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, I'm excited about this conversation because this book feels like the major one. Like the major one from my childhood. And
yes. This is the one we read under the covers. I even remember reading it under the bed. I don't know what the logic was
under
there.
The bed.
Maybe so
That's
the monsters.
a good idea.
Yeah.
Tales to read under the bed. Yeah,
okay.
That's good.
It doesn't quite make sense to adult logic, but it did to my kid brain. So.
You know what? But that's the thing about these kinds of stories. Sometimes that's why they work. Before we start, can you tell me a little bit about your own scary story work and just a little brief intro?
Absolutely. So I am the author of a whole lot of different kinds of books for a whole lot of different age ranges and in a lot of categories. But relevant to this podcast, I have a young adult thriller, psychological suspense, in which there is a murder at summer camp. It's less of a who did it and more of a why did it. But I see it on some summer scaries lists, and that's always thrilling to me. My most recent middle grade novel, Wishing Season, involves a kid who is arguably a ghost, but it is not a scary kind of ghost. It's a comforting kind of ghost. But I do have a collection of very spooky stories called Hide and Don't Seek and Other Very Scary Stories. And it is a collection of 20 original spooky tales. Some of them are as silly as they are scary. Some of them will send a tingle up your spine. And a few are designed to make you hide under the covers and not want to come back out. So only read those ones if you're feeling very brave.
Yeah, I agree. I'd read it. I love that book, and I read it when it came out, and was just flipping through it again yesterday to sort of like rebrief myself. And that last poem, if I was like, oh my God, Anica has gone in. She has gone in, and I love it. I love leaning into the absolute gore, silly, kind of very scary rhyming, sort of echoing some of the things from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark.
You can see the influence, right? And for me,
Yeah,
I'll
absolutely.
say anything gory has to come with a heavy dose of humor because I'm not
For
a gore person. And if it's just gore on its own, I cannot handle it. But if you make it funny,
yeah,
that allows me to process it.
and so you think that's like a scary kidlit sort of necessity in terms of gore and
I don't think
things
for
eating
everyone,
things eating people's faces and the creatures
right?
behind.
But for me as a reader, we can get into this as we go, but I'm kind of a fraidy cat. So when I told some of my friends and family that I was writing horror stories, I got some strange and surprised looks because
Yeah,
I famously can't watch the show Buffy. It's too scary for me, right?
really.
Yes. You mentioned, oh, maybe we'll watch the movie of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark before we have this podcast. Dan, I could not do it. I know I wouldn't sleep for weeks.
Yeah,
But when
it's
I'm
intense.
but when I'm controlling the scaries, that's different. So writing the stories, I mean, it's a way of facing your fears as well and examining them and prodding them and also maybe hopefully defanging them. But but I did eat up this book as a kid and had a lot of
Mhm.
fun rereading it for the first time in over 40 years in preparation for this. And I think one of the reasons I was able to handle this is that it has such heavy doses of humor mixed in,
Mhm.
particularly in the poems.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's like a whole section at the end which is all horror with humor.
Yes.
Um,
And it makes
and some.
sense, right? Because
Mhm.
horror and humor are both about anticipation, right? What the reader is
Oh
anticipating
yeah.
or the listener is anticipating, and how the storyteller will meet or subvert those expectations. And both of them involve those elements of surprise.
Mhm.
So the silly, scary stories in this book, it's almost in place of the jump scare, you get the jump twist, and it's a silly one that makes you laugh instead of scream, which is equally satisfying because there's the build-up, the anticipation that lead to both of those
Mhm.
things.
That's really, yeah. I like that. That makes a lot of sense. I'd like to start off with a question for you. Basically, that I want to ask all of the guests who come on to this show, and that is, do you remember the first time you ever felt frightened?
Ooh, I love this question, and I'll be excited to hear other people's answers. My first memories, both my first happy memory and my first scary memory, are both of vivid dreams I had as a very young child. I have always had intense dreams. I have intense dreams now, and the line between awake and asleep is especially blurry for me, perhaps because I am a sleepwalker, have been since childhood. And I used to be a lucid dreamer up until my early 30s. Maybe that's why I remember these intense dreams more than I remember actual early memories. So I don't know if that was the first time I was scared, but I remember some of those very young child nightmares, and they tended to involve psychological horror more than physical horror, which I think is a recurring theme for me. I'm certainly interested in vampires and ghosts and things like that, but it's the imagining the situation and the bad choices you have to make about who you might hurt or what consequences your actions might have or what you might have caused. Those were early themes in those early nightmares, where there was often something threatening my family. And there was one in particular I had again and again where bad guys would come in the house and tie up my parents and my older brother, and I was hiding in the boxes so I didn't get tied up. And they would sort of leave the room almost in comical villain way of, well, we'll be back at 3:03 p.m. and you'd better still be tied up in these chairs. And as soon as they left, I would untie my family and it would be okay, but then I would have to tie them back up in anticipation of the bad guys coming and hope I'd done it right so that they wouldn't see that. Right. I don't know why we couldn't just leave the house before 3:03 p.m., but this happened again and again.
They literally gave you the blueprint for how to survive. And you're like, no, we must follow the rules.
Exactly. And my guilt for having hidden successfully, but not having been able to hide them and not really being able to save them. And then therefore being part of their terror, because I was then the one tying them up. That psychological element to the horror is it makes sense to me that my early fears involved those things, because my later fears involve those things too.
Do you feel like those nightmares have influenced what you have written in terms of, like, you've talked about your psychological sort of thriller YA. Mm-hmm. What was the name of it again?
That's called Nobody Knows But You.
Nobody Knows But You. Do you feel like any of that sort of early fear from those dreams sort of influenced any of the psychological elements of the work that you've been doing?
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned that Nobody Knows But You in particular is more of a why done it than who done it. So examining those deeper emotions and motivations that bring us to see the world the way we do and act the way we do, especially in tense or scary or situations or relationships with other people. That's thickly throughout that novel. Yeah. What do we owe each other? What do we really know of each other? How will we act in extreme situations?
I've had some nightmares, because I remember my dreams too, and really always have. And I remember some of the scariest ones, not necessarily being like anything that you'd find in scary stories to tell in the dark, but more of like, oh, I killed somebody by accident.
Yes. What
do I do now? Like, not even in terms of the law, but like, how do I reconcile what I've done with continuing to live my life? Like, those dreams are so disturbing to me, and I don't know where they come from, but some kind of guilt or something. But I can imagine playing around with elements like that. I don't know if that would work in like a middle grade book or film for kids, but like definitely the YA space is all about I Know What You Did Last Summer, like that,
totally.
That kind of thing.
I was going for that in one of the stories in Hide and Don't Seek. It's called Two Wishes, and it's about twins, a brother and a sister, who find a magic book where they, when you write down a wish, maybe it comes true. And the girl has the book first, and the boy keeps sneaking into the room to see what she wrote down for her wish, because of course she hasn't told him. And she wrote something like, "I wish I could fly." And he thinks she has turned into this bug that is circling around their room, and he doesn't know what he's going to do without his twin, and he feels like the only answer to her wish gone wrong is to wish the same thing. And so he wishes something like, "I wish to be a bug just like this one," and he turns into a bug. And then as soon as that happens, she comes back full of excitement from outside where she's been actually flying around, and her brother is a bug. And I end with her reaching for a fly swatter because she doesn't know yet. And to me, what's so terrifying about that is not any of the stuff that's actually on the page, but as a reader, imagining if she hits him with that fly swatter and then sees his wish and figures it out, how will she live with that for the rest of her life? What?
Yeah, that's dark.
Understandable, right? It is. It is. And I guess part of what makes it darkness for middle grade is that that part is not explicitly on the page. That's left for some readers to imagine or not. They can take it at face value, turn the page, keep going, move to the next scary thing. There are scary things that happen on the page that you can just let the story be about that if you are not ready to spiral into my deeper existential fears and questions.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Do you feel like you can tell listeners who aren't familiar with the term middle grade, like what the difference is between young adult and middle grade literature?
Absolutely. Middle grade is an age level. Those books are aimed usually at ages 8 to 12 or 9 to 13 or somewhere within that range. We have what's called lower middle grade or upper middle grade, which maybe skew a little bit younger or older, but mostly safely in that 8 to 12 category. Of course, adults and older readers can read those books too, and some precocious 6 or 7-year-olds might pick up something in that category too. So as always, it depends on the individual, but the writer's intention in tone, vocabulary, interest level is aiming at those readers. And often the protagonists will be in that age category too, but you can certainly have books about adults for middle grade readers or about younger kids. And then young adult is a point of view. It's also a category of the bookstore and often considered an age category, but I think it depends on the writer. But the point of view is you're holding on to that teenage perspective. It's more rare, although there certainly are stunning examples, like Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe or An Arrow to the Moon by Emily X.R. Pan, that includes some adult point of views or younger character point of views. But mostly, whether it's in third person or first person or second person, you are following that teenage perspective. So this is different from an adult novel that has a teenage protagonist, in that in YA, we tend to stay in the now, in the moment, and don't have that what I know now that I didn't know then perspective that might be creeping into some of those adult novels that have teenagers in them.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So in terms of like the topic that you chose, the Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, illustrated by Stephen Gammell?
I wondered that too. Gammell? We don't know. It's one of the mysteries of this book.
And he is notoriously shy, doesn't really, give interviews or talk about his work so much.
But he gave us this beautiful, creepy art. Can we just first talk about how the illustrations make these books?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, getting back to the middle grade versus YA, like this book kind of breaks all of those rules, right?
Yes.
Like, what is this book? Is it a book for adults? Is it a book for kids? The language is like more like simpler than simple, right? Yes. But a lot of the characters are adults, and a lot of the situations deal with tragedy and violence and all the stuff that you find in any kind of horror. And also the way that he organized the book is like almost the last third of the physical book is notes and sources and stories about where he found inspiration to collect all of these stories.
Right, because he didn't invent any of the stories. For anyone not familiar, he collected these from various sources around the country, though a lot of them in Maine, where I am from, which is also a Stephen King country, and the inspiration for a lot of different spooky things. So he went back and forth between Princeton, New Jersey, where I think he might have been a professor, but there's certainly an academic bent to this collection. One thing I did notice, even though a lot of the protagonists are adults, there are children throughout the book, but no children are harmed in these stories. Did you notice that? They're psychologically harmed, but no children die, I think.
I didn't notice that.
Or if they do, it's off page. It's sort of implied. But I think the deaths that we see and even the ghosts that we see are adults. And in some of the back matter, in some of those notes about the stories, one thing I love as an adult and didn't care about as a kid is that it tells us some of the alternate versions of these folktales he's collected. In this region we have this story, and in this time period it was told in this way with these changes to the characters or the ending or things like that. And some of those alternate versions of the tales in the footnotes involve children who reached unfortunate ends. And I wondered if part of how, in his mind, he made these timeless tales that were clearly told to all audiences and not necessarily originally intended for children, part of how he made them for children might have been removing that. But these stories, interestingly, paved the way for our books in which children aren't always kept safe in those ways.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have, when I learned that you had your scary story collection coming out, I was really excited because I'd been working on one myself, and I was on a podcast in summer of 2022, and the interviewer was like, Dan, there were some other kid-lit authors on the podcast as well, and talking about how, like, in horror literature for kids, you have to give them hope. And I was like, and then the interviewer, Neil McRobert, is wonderful. His show is Talking Scared. If you're ever interested in hearing the ins and outs from the authors themselves of current horror literature, he's great. But he turns to me and he's like, and Dan, your books are just filled with dead children. And I was like, oops.
Right. The barrier has been broken. And Tales to Keep You Up at Night, your first short story collection within a larger framework story, is one of my favorite books of yours. And I've been a fan since the beginning, and Stone Child all the way up through Ghost Hunter's Daughter and everything before this. But I really ate up this one.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I do think that when you're sharing stories like these with kids, having that element of hope and, like, safety at the end is part of it, and it is important. But also, like, I don't know if it's 100% like necessary.
I think
I don't know. I definitely, like, when I was pitching this thing and putting it together, like, talking to the editor and my agent, and them asking me, like, who is this for? Because I had teenage characters, I had little kid characters. The main sort of bookend narrative is about a 12-year-old girl, and I was like, we keep coming back to her, so I do feel like it is a middle grade book, and
yes.
And the language and that I use and all that. It's just it was more to entertain young people, and so they put an age recommendation of, like, 10 and up on it. So, like, not necessarily, like, focused toward some of my other readers, my other books, who maybe a third grader could even pick some of those up if they were brave enough.
Yeah, but I really think that kids process what they're ready to process. It's one of the amazing things about encountering something scary, whether it's horror or an emotional situation unrelated to horror, on the page, is that you get to process it in the detail and at the rate that you are ready for, which is different from watching a movie, for example, where the horror is presented to you and those images arise, whether you want to imagine them or not. I also think, in terms of scary material for the kids, first of all, we both know kids can handle a lot. And it's different for a kid to imagine a child's death than it is for an adult to imagine a child's death. It's the ways and reasons it's horrifying are different. But for any reader, I think that imagining the worst that can happen is almost a way of building a talisman against it, right? So if you're a reader imagining yourself in a horror story where the worst thing happens to that protagonist, you're imagining how you might survive it, right? So they have the power to help you think about how you're going to face monstrous situations, which is empowering. You can be empowered by a story where terrible, terrible things happen. And scary stories, which have so much allegory in them, are therefore perfect for examining sort of subconscious fears, revealing what lies beneath all of the deepest, darkest worries that can be underneath those monster stories or death stories. Putting those on the page for kids to recognize them is powerful too, right? Whether it's a scary story or not, seeing a situation in which someone who is not you faces bullying you can relate to, or faces issues of power and privilege, or I have a story that is really confronting the fact that we teach girls they must be nice and the bad things that can lead to for those girls. And you can read those stories as straight, oh, this evil crow is torturing this girl in this way, and here's the thing that happens. But if you're ready to recognize those emotional things happening underneath it, I aim to thrill and terrify readers, but I also aim to empower them by putting those fears down and making them real in a way that affirms the child's experiences and existence, and there helps them put a name to something, helps them face and therefore know better how to confront those fears because they've thought through those worst case scenarios.
Yeah, I mean that's an incredible way to put it.
And if we protect the kid from that, they don't get to go through that whole mental exercise, and they are ashamed and hiding those demons instead of learning to defang them.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say that because this book and this series has been highly controversial throughout its life since its publication in, what was it, 81 or something like that?
Yeah, I think the first one was 81, up through 91 is the third one.
Yeah, so there's been lots of adults who either don't want, they think they're protecting their kids by not letting them read this, not letting them look at the pictures, which are
yes.
sometimes scarier than the actual stories themselves.
Agreed.
I want to sort of dig into the book itself. So we're just talking about the first book, which I've read probably a dozen or more times. I know I read it over and over when I was a kid.
Same.
And I keep going back to it as an adult just to sort of remember like what it was that he did and was trying to do, and how he did it and how he was effective. And so in my reread, I distinctly remember many of the stories, but some of the others sort of have like, they just flew out of my head. And it was like I was reading the book for the first time again. I was like, I don't remember this story at all.
Which ones did you remember? Because, I said, I hadn't picked it up in over 40 years. I wrote down what I remembered first before reading it, and was
smart.
Interested. Yeah. And then some things I remembered as soon as the story started. I was, oh, right, this one, and could remember everything vividly. But one of the things I love about this book, and one of the reasons it made me want to write a scary story collection, is that this is the book that we would all, sitting in the college dining hall. Oh, do you remember that story about this? Or, right, those pieces of it that would come back into my head. It not only scared and thrilled me at the time, but so much of it stuck with me and came back at various times. So what were those stories for you in it?
Well, I'm not sure if if it's because it's the first story or because it's just so effective. But the one that's stuck with me from this particular volume is The Big Toe.
Yes.
And it's one that I've shared with many people in social situations. Like they're like, hey, do you know any scary stories? I want to sort of be Halloweeny with my kid, and I'm like, yeah, check out The Big Toe, which for anybody who hasn't read the book, it's like a page and a half. It's in the jump scare section. It's about a kid who finds a toe in a field and plucks it out of the field and hears something scamper or slither away or something, and he brings it home, and his mom is like, oh, great, I'll cook it up and we'll
they eat it. They eat the toe.
They'll divide it into 3. And they eat the toe.
Yes.
And then the scary part is like something comes at night and asks a question, shouting out into the shadows, who where's my toe, or like who took my toe.
Where's my toe?
Yes, and that's how you have to read it. I remember reading this to somebody who was much older than me, and liked this book, remembered the book from the 80s as well. I got to the end of this story and I did the jump scare. You've got it. And this guy just screamed like a child. And
Amazing.
I mean, my default to when I'm scared or appreciating somebody else being scared, of course, like you're in a movie, there's a jump scare, like it's immediately followed by like laughter release, that kind of like catharsis. And I started laughing, and then he started laughing, and it felt really bad because he got so scared. But anyway, the big toe is iconic.
Yes, I remembered that one too. I think part of why I remembered it, not only like you said, it's the first one, but perhaps because it's first, it contains some of the most instruction on how to tell it out loud and scare other people, which is an interesting piece of this book, and was one of the things that interested me as a kid. I mentioned before the parallel between humor and horror. And both with horror and with humor, I really wanted to study it. How is this done? What makes this scary? Why is this choice scarier than another choice or funnier than another choice? So I would pore over those joke books in the same way that I pored over scary stories to tell in the dark, which is trying to figure out, okay, but how and why? And he really explicitly sets up, these are stories to tell out loud, and he invites you to imagine yourself as the storyteller, which is perhaps also one of the ways to make it less scary and for children, but also super appealing because kids want to know things and they want to know how to do things and how to create things and how to create, how to make someone scream. So it's empowering and it's instructional. His introduction really sets up, when you tell these scary stories, tell them as it's getting dark. Maybe you're around a fireplace. Hush your voice to make it scarier, right? It has those instructional things. And in the jump scare section and the big toe included, it has these moments of, when you say this part, move toward the person or make your voice loud, or right. And
stage directions.
You're invited in. It's one of the genius things. And it's one of the things that makes it really specifically for middle grade, to go back to your earlier question, is that it's teaching that kid how to be not just scared by this, but part of creating the situation, which, as I said, I can't watch a horror movie now, but I can write a very scary story because I'm part of creating that scary situation for someone else. And so the kid reader who is let in that way is allowed that level of protection from the story if they want it, of here's how you scare someone else with this. And there you can see behind the scenes. It doesn't have to scare you in the same way if you don't want it to, although it also does.
Something else about this particular story that I noticed, and it sets up his style for the rest of the book. And like I said earlier, his language usage is simpler than simple.
Yes.
So much of this particular story, The Big Toe, is about what he doesn't say, right? It's like, when is this taking place? Where is this field? Why is this family desperate enough to cook some rotting thing that some child plucked out of the ground?
Yeah.
Clearly it's a human toe, and they have no problem popping it into their mouths.
That's one of those things that if you think about it afterwards, the story gets scarier.
It does.
Yeah.
And I think that's why this one in particular stuck with me. Some of the other ones that really stuck with me, I think, were in the urban legend section of the book.
Me too.
So I always remember the hook. I always remember the babysitter. I even remember the babysitter's name, Doreen. Like the name Doreen in this book terrifies me. I don't know why. It's like she's not even the scary part of the story. It's just like he's so effective in the way he crafted that very brief, twisted story that is very well known. It's the calls coming from inside the house kind of thing.
Dan, we have the same ones. That whole section of what he calls other dangers. And then he says, these are
Yeah.
stories from more recent times. They're the dangers we face in our lives today. Whereas a lot of them have a more old-timey feel. And the hook, the babysitter. For me, there's also a murderer in the back seat of the car, and another car. She doesn't know that there's a guy hiding in the back seat of her car. Most of the story is there's a girl driving home, a teenager, down a rural road at night, and there's a truck that keeps coming up behind her and turning on its high beams. And even when she turns down the road where no one else lives, the truck keeps on her and it's driving too close, and we're scared of the truck. And then the twist is when she gets home and runs inside and calls the police, and the police come, and the man who has gotten out with his gun says, "It's not me you want. It's that guy in the back seat with the knife who was going to stab her. So when I saw him get in the car, I followed home." We had no cell phones then, of course. And every time he reached up to attack her, I would turn on my high beams. So it's doubly scary. And that's one of the ones that I remembered it then, but it became one of my fears later when I read this as a 9 or 10-year-old. I was not a driver, of course. But it made me always check the back seat because that story stuck with me when I became a teenage driver.
Yeah. Absolutely. I spent my teenage years in New Jersey, in a town called Basking Ridge, and we all know at least central northern New Jersey is the land of malls.
Yes.
South Jersey too. I know there's just malls. Back when malls were a thing. And I remember kind of an urban legend that was going around, in my town. Be careful when you come back to your car in the parking lot, because people are hiding under your cars with knives and they're slashing your Achilles heels.
Yes.
And I was like, oh my God, now I have to check under my car before I get into my car, because somebody might, it's not even a person in the back seat. It's like outside, you're not safe anywhere. And I think it's probably another version of this urban legend that he sort of tracked down and turned into this classic version of it. Have you heard of anybody who's gone through anything actually like the stories in this book?
Oh gosh.
In that particular section?
Well, the immediate urban legend that bounces to mind is the one we all heard in college about that if you get too drunk and pass out, someone will steal your kidneys and you'll wake up in a bathtub full of ice.
Bathtub full of ice. Yep.
But in terms of things that actually happen to people, the style of the storytelling in Scary Stories to Tell of the Dark, like you said, it's so simple. There isn't a lot of setup there. He doesn't linger on evocative details the way both of us do in our middle grade, where we're trying to set more of a scene and tell a story that's longer than a page and a half. Remind me of the style of almost the matter-of-fact ways that storytellers I grew up with would tell scary tales or regular tales.
In Maine, on the island?
In Maine, yes. And it's a fishing community called Deer Island. It's definitely an island full of storytellers. And my dad is a very spare storyteller. He doesn't go into a ton of detail, but he was a small town doctor. And as such, he had access to a lot of people's stories or experiences. And one of his own experiences that he told me once, years after it happened, when I asked him if he believed in ghosts, was of a woman who he called to let her know that her husband had just died. And that had happened in the hospital, and the woman had been home at that time. And when he called to say your husband just passed away, she said, "Oh, I know. He was just here to tell me." Came to the foot of her, right? And that's it. That's the whole story. And when I asked for further questions and details, there were none to be shared. He shut back up. But I feel like that's a whole Alvin Schwartz story. It takes up half a page. That's all you need. You turn the page to get to the next one. Part of what's so effective about the super shortness of the stories in this book is that you're like, wait, what? And then I at least would just turn the page and read the next one. You get that accumulative effect of multiple scary stories sort of adding up inside you.
I think another part of the appeal of the very short bursts is that they are very short bursts, and for kids who are tentative,
yes,
they can get that one thrill and be like, okay, putting the book down and then like think about it and come back to it, you
Yes.
know. And
Get
I
it
think
over
that
with.
that's, I think that was something that a librarian had mentioned to me recently when I was discussing Tales to Keep You Up at Night, my own book. That, you know, for reluctant readers or kids who maybe didn't think that they were ready for a full horror novel, you know, and there are so many being published right now, which I think is wonderful, because that was my dream. You know, when I was a kid, just have like endless, sort of endless content that we call it content now, endless titles to sort of explore, and I think it was like you know, growing up in the '80s, you're only a few years younger than I am,
I
right?
am 1 year younger than you, I think.
What? No way. Okay, so then we had the same experience.
Yes. Born in the late
Like
70s, growing up in
born in the late
in
'70s,
the
growing
80s.
up
Yeah.
in the '80s, like it was a golden age of horror. It was one of those, and the 20th century had a few of those. I'm curious about like this urban legend section, and how like one of my obsessions recently, and maybe this is embarrassing to say, but like I can't stop watching true crime documentary series. For me, it again, I feel like it's I don't have to invest myself in like a 2 hour, possibly a 2 hour scary movie, or like a series that I have to follow from episode to episode. Like I can get a jolt of fear, from a 40-minute episode of something, and despite the fact that, you know, a lot of horrible things have happened to real people in real life, like I almost sort of see it as a like a learning experience for myself. I'm
Yeah.
like, how did they survive? What were the clues or the cues that they either, you know, didn't pick up on or ignored? I'm like, so for me, I'm just kind of like, it's just one more way of like processing the world that I'm living in, and I wonder if that has any sort of correlation to these urban legend tales that Schwartz sort of went out and found.
Yes, because they are both warnings, right? Maybe you should be checking in your back seat. Could happen. And layers of protection against it, right? You learn to recognize patterns, perhaps, if you've read a lot of scary
Yeah.
stories. So you'll learn to when to recognize your instincts that something is off, or what kinds of places might be dangerous. And of course, there's a danger in the stereotypes that rise from some of that too, which is a topic for a whole other podcast. And you know, not every story in his collection has aged well, in terms of gender roles and expectations, in terms of racial or ethnic stereotypes, or just things like that too.
Or
And so you
even
can
just getting mythology right. Like
exactly.
I think of the Wendigo, and how I'm like, he does sort of address, he like in the Wendigo he talks about this thing that swoops down from the sky and carries you away, and I was like, that was what I thought a Wendigo was, until actually started looking into the, you know, the actual Native American folklore,
Yes.
and realized no, a Wendigo is like a cannibal, like a spirit that like takes somebody over and makes them ravenous and insatiably hungry, and sometimes even cannibalistic. So yeah, I'm still kind of confused about his sources on that one, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is another version of what a Wendigo is, but yeah.
Yeah, I don't know the truth of that, but reading that one, I was on edge for different reasons than what I was supposed to be of what's going to come here. And
The
then,
other elements to it too.
yeah, some of them have more of an immediacy of someone who understands this world is telling this story. And some of them have that sense that you're hearing someone tell a story that they acquired through a game of telephone. And maybe the
Yeah.
original person who told the story understood it well enough to get those details right. But then something changed, something changed, something changed. And by the end, perhaps a Wendigo, or perhaps whatever other detail is not really showing us what the original version is too far morphed to be recognizable to someone who really knows.
But I mean, it's interesting because that is the nature of these folk tales. Yes. And the oral traditions of the many parts of this country that he collected these from. You know, usually rural areas, and even the way that he was able to change them from what his sources were, and that I think that's the nature of storytelling. You know,
and again, that instructional element of how he includes some that are in first person. I was on this ship, and right, you can imagine adapting that and making it true for yourself. Or my cousin who lived in the city knew someone who this, right, and that is the way kids tell those urban legends and adults as well.
Yeah. I mean, that makes me think of your book and the way that you incorporate many different kind of styles of stories. There are poems, there's a play, there's even like a text back and forth.
Yes.
Were you inspired by any part of this book to make those choices for Hide and Don't Seek?
So Hide and Don't Seek came about. I was actually in the house where I grew up in rural Maine on an island, where I've been lucky to spend a lot of time as an adult. My parents no longer live there, but they still have the house. And since I write full time, I'm often able to go up and spend months or weeks at a time immersing myself in projects. And I do some of my best writing there, I think, because it is a place where, of course, my childhood memories and emotions and fears and understanding of the world are very close at hand, because that's the house where I had them. And some of my vivid memories of childhood are of books that I read as a child in that house. So I was between projects, and I was thinking about books that stuck with me as an adult, and what it was about them. And one of the ones that popped immediately to mind was Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And I was just remembering the experience of reading those stories in this house. Like I said, under the blankets, sometimes under the bed for some reason. What was the childhood logic there? Right. We will never know. But, and then thinking about how the pieces of those stories that stuck with me as an adult, and I thought, I want to tell stories that people will remember 30, 40 years later, share with their friends, laugh about that story and their childhood reaction to it with their adult friends. And so I thought, well, maybe I could tell a horror story. Here I am in a house with huge barns and mist that rolls in the morning and bats that fly out of the attic every night and all of those things other people consider scary and I consider home. So I wrote the first story, which tapped into some childhood fears about abandonment and lovability and one's brother leaving one alone, not telling one to go hide. And this one it's the Hide and Don't Seek. It's the title story about a kid who goes and hides in a cornfield, and her brother does not come find her. And then things happen after that. So again, as someone with an older brother, and I was tapping into the emotions of that childhood dynamic and then crafting a spooky story around it. And I got hooked. And I certainly was inspired to try the first poem ones, because I remembered that I did not reread Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark in order to do this. I just went by what I remembered of the experience of reading it. And then, okay, what's scary to me? What's scary physically? What's scary emotionally? How can I spin that into a story? And so once I'd written one or two, read them out loud to my nieces, had the fun of that, I thought, what if I could write a whole collection? Okay, I'm going to try to write 13 scary stories, because that's a scary number, even though there ended up being 20 in the book. And I spent that summer in Maine thinking of a different scary scenario or mood or moment that I could build a story around. And quickly came this idea of what's a format in which I can tell a story. That, like you said, a story told entirely of text messages. How do I meet that challenge? How do you make that scary? What's a story told in the script of a play, narrated by a dog? Again, in verse. How do I use that format to enhance the story, to make it sillier, to make it scarier, to make it unique? So So the variety in Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and the mood of it directly inspired Hood and Don't Seek. But then I tried to vividly make those my own.
Yeah, and absolutely, they live, on a very specific Anica Mrose Rissi, level. So
Thank you.
yeah, it's fun. Like, one of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was to sort of look back at the things that sort of were foundational to us and how they inspired us to do what we're doing now. And like, that's an perfect example of the heart of what I've been trying to sort of want to talk to people about. You want to talk? Oh wait, we could talk about the illustrations.
Yes, the illustrations.
Just like we mentioned, like, there were some stories that lingered long after reading this book. There also were some illustrations that absolutely did the same thing, and to give a listener sort of an idea of what we're talking about when we're talking about these illustrations. Do you feel like you can even put into words what Stephen Gammell was doing here?
That's hard. Some of it is spot art, meaning small pieces with maybe just a figure. And some of it is a whole page or a whole scene showing environment and figures in them. And all of them, I think he actually did it with charcoal and pencil, but it has a watercolor feel because there's a lot of smudging going on there, in with the distinct lines. And I think that, just like with the writing, where sometimes it's the suggestion of something that's scarier than what's actually on the page, the illustrations for me, part of why they stuck with me so much, besides the gorgeousness that pulls you in and then the creepiness that makes you want to protect yourself from it, is that it's this combination of the vividly real and the intensely mystical, that smudging, that some figures or scenes kind of blur out of reality, but then, wow, is that eyeball detailed and real in the same illustration, right? So it's that combination of the world we know and the one we imagine, both within that same charcoaled scene. And the things that he makes creepy that are not even necessarily originally meant to be creepy. So the story we were talking about earlier, the toe, I've remembered this illustration too. It's a kid who looks scary, even though in the book the scary thing is happening to him. Though, as you pointed out, Dan, I don't know, this kid from a family where they eat toes, maybe the kid is scary too. But one of the things I remember being obsessed with as a kid, and when I opened this book again, I was obsessed with it again, is the way that Stephen Gammell does hands, which of course are famously difficult to draw, but the hands, whether they are real and lifelike, or whether they are dripping like blood in a story that doesn't have blood, but just the way he draws them, it's almost like these extension of branches or of blood dripping, right? Those little details that he puts in, that something is not quite right here, even if, again, the character he's drawing is not the one who's supposed to be the scary one in the story. He adds those little things for you to notice and freak yourself out about. And that's part of the genius of it for me.
I feel like the illustrations really tie everything together and turn it into like a world building exercise in a way. Like, you look at all of these illustrations and you're like, I recognize our planet Earth that that I'm living on in these stories and in some of the pictures, but it's like looking through a very cloudy, dark, dirty mirror or window where things are twisted and surreal. It's like the images you would see in your dreams, where something is a little blurry or smudged, and then like a very realistic eye like comes right up beside you in your bedroom at night. Is there, like before, the question I asked about like what stories stuck around. Was there any illustrations that you, in rereading, you came upon and were like, oh yeah, I remember that, or like, that's never left my head,
Yeah.
or were there ones that you had kind of forgotten and rediscovered and were like, ooh, that's kind of cool, I don't remember that one.
My memories of this book were not visual, the way that I said, as a 16-year-old driver, I would suddenly remember this story and the telling of it, or you mentioned remembering the name of the babysitter, and those elements stuck in my head. But I remember the experience of poring over those drawings, and when I opened, but I couldn't have, attempted to draw any of them for you or even describe them necessarily in detail. But when I looked at them, I remembered them. They had imprinted somewhere. And maybe that's something about how visual memory works that's different from how retaining a story works. And some of the stories that I vividly remembered, I'd gotten certain details wrong or changed them in my head as well, speaking of that game of telephone. It's interesting what you're saying about the unreality of these stories, of these illustrations, which I think both makes them creepier and creates a protection from them, right? There's a layer of protection, and while this isn't quite the world as I know it, it's this one I'm imagining. But when I look up from the book, the people in my life do not look like this. Their hands do not look like this. The trees, I can imagine them turning into that kind of tree, but it is not as inherently scary as this tree. And that's interesting to me because my understanding is that you mentioned how many times this book has been challenged or banned. And I think that some of the objections about this is too scary for children. I think the illustrations were always directly cited in this of how can we show kids this art? But I think it's cleverly done in that, well, if it were more straight realistic, that would be harder to process. Dan is currently holding up for me to look at various pieces of art from the book. So he's both creeping me out and reminding me of how I felt as a kid looking at those. And yes, so many of those, it was just, yep, that one, that woman with no eyes and that stringy hair that somehow brings it all together. I couldn't have told you that was in the book, but as soon as I saw it, I knew it, which actually, that's interesting. A dream is like that too. The things in your dream that you look different, but and also if you encounter something in a dream, you know what it is, even though you couldn't have described it. That's what it would look like because it's all different. So maybe that's part of the dreamlike quality we're talking about here too.
Yeah, I think that there's something to be said about that, and I think that the dreamlike aspect of Schwartz's writing, in terms of its simplicity and sort of vagueness, combined with the very bizarre illustrations, definitely. I think it's the combination of those two things that have made this book, last and find new generations of readers. I don't want to disparage anybody else's work, but when they put out they put out a reboot of the illustrations, a different illustrator. I don't know, what was that, like 15 years ago? 10, 15 years ago?
Something like that. An illustrator whose work I love.
Wonderful, yeah.
Yeah, but not for this collection. It didn't
have the same vibe. It was just a completely different book, and I'm not sure, but I don't think people responded to it, and so
I think there was outrage, and they reissued it again with the original art, is my understanding. Yeah. I think you can now find both editions, and I have not looked at the alternate one. My original copies of this book are in Maine, and I am in New Jersey as we record this, so I deliberately sought out the original version to look at it because I knew the art would be part of what we would want to revisit here because it was such an important part of the reading experience.
Well, listen, we're just hitting about an hour now, and I don't want to keep you too long. This has been a really fun conversation. It's really fun to revisit this title, so I want to thank you for coming on here and talking about your first fears with me.
Thank you. This was so much fun. I have that shivery feeling of having just heard a good story.
Nice.
So, here we are. We survived. I'm so grateful to Anica Mrose Rissi for being one of my first guinea pigs here on Our First Fears. I'm also grateful that she's so much more eloquent than I managed to be during that talk. Much fewer ums and likes and uhs from her than me. But like I said at the beginning, I'm learning as I go, and I'm fighting through those tightly wound nerves of mine. I hope you got as much out of our conversation as I did. Anica's insights, not only as a writer, but as a reader, a former children's book editor, and a former child, made one of my favorite titles from childhood even more interesting to me and opened my eyes to certain elements of scary stories that I never saw before. Please do check out Anica's books. The scary ones, Hide and Don't Seek, and Nobody Knows But You, and also her not-so-scary ones. And as she said, Anica's latest is called Wishing Season, which features a possible haunting and an atmospheric island setting. It's gotten a ton of starred reviews and sits at the top of my own to-be-read list. Though I'm new to this whole podcasting endeavor, I understand that it's customary for podcasters, I'm a podcaster now, to ask listeners to leave ratings and reviews. So if you liked what you heard, I'd so appreciate that from you on wherever you listen to your podcasts. As for the future, I've got a bunch of upcoming conversations that I'm thrilled to share. I'm talking with people I've admired for years about the scariest things I've always loved. I hope you'll come back again and listen. If you'd like, you can follow the show's social media at Our First Fears, one word, and feel free to reach out at ourfirstfears@gmail.com. Thanks for your time. I'm Dan Poblocki, wishing you sweet dreams and pleasant nightmares. Sleep tight.